Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the audience, that is you, for your sustained quietness and well-behavedness. And I hope you will be able to do that for another few minutes. My passion is the form of things. More specifically, the form of the objects, things, physical elements, buildings, roads, infrastructures, parks, that make up our cities. And yes, it is true, as Bart was just pointing out, that the way in which cities grow and change is incredibly complex and filtered by many very different and almost mutually incompatible fields of knowledge: hydrology, topography, real estate, anthropology, transportation, etc., you name it. But somehow, all these complex systems and all these different fields of knowledge coalesce in a residue, an output. That is the world in which we live in, a world of objects that together make up our cities. And the final outlook of these objects, the way in which they're currently stacked, that I think is a very fascinating configurational problem in and of itself. I'm showing you this picture as an opener because I'd like to present to you a hypothesis or a discussion about how certain recent technological changes might really affect urban design and the form of cities in the future. Some of those recent changes involve remote sensing, the Internet of Things, more specifically the way in which different objects can talk to each other, and in a more general way, the way in which our cities are becoming more intelligent. You've all heard about the smart city paradigm. I'm not into that technology, but there are huge potential ramifications for the form of things and for urban design in of itself. I'm not sure if any of you know this painting. If you do, I'm happy for you. If you don't, this is Kazimir Malevich's White Square on White, which is his painting from 1918. It's a modernist painting, and I would venture to argue with you that perhaps the modernist promise of pure and complete abstraction in space is one that has for the longest time remained in art as a very strong and clear statement, but is about to potentially move out of pure art and move into the realm of cities, into the realm of urban design. And if that's the case, then we can see a square, a plaza, a large, very precisely defined plaza, but nevertheless completely open, completely indeterminate, open for all of you and you and you and you to all put your own imaginations and desires to project those onto that. In other words, a square that is truly democratic, even though it's precise and bounded. But moreover, the area around the square, which is also white, which are the buildings of the city, let's say, also open, also universally hospitable to almost any kind of function, program, desire, and dream. That's the kind of city we might be evolving into. I'll try to develop this hypothesis a little bit with you, but first we got to take a step back and check some facts, some fundamental observations about the city that I'm not sure we're on the same page about. It's important to realize that notwithstanding what you may think, and you may think that, for instance, people are moving back into city centers, that downtowns are reviving, and all that's true. Certain kinds of people are moving back into city centers, but you know what? Others are moving out. I want to argue with you that the big development that we are seeing in cities today, whether it's in Western Europe or in the United States, is not one of further densification of city centers, but in fact of a gradual densification of our suburbs, of that huge metropolitan system that sits around the city center. The one that most of us live in, a lot of us go shopping in, some of us work at, but none of us really acknowledge as part of the city. Now that's really the city. So these are just some statistics that you can see about a series of cities in North America. And mind you, cities like Boston, Chicago, New York have very attractive downtowns. It's definitely attractive to go move into a city center there. And people are doing that. However, many, many, many more people are actually moving into the suburbs. So what we see is a gradual thickening of the plot, a rising of the overall density of suburbs in our cities. This is important, and we'll discuss the consequences in a second. Another observation, we may think that suburbs are all about being green. And that's why you move there. That's you want to live in a sense of privacy, with a big natural surrounding that you feel good about yourself and feels healthy. And that's fine. This, by the way, this is a slide of the Boston area, where all the gray is mostly the suburban content, and the red is the more historic city center area. Or the same thing for around here, around Brussels and Flanders, where red are compact city centers, and the gray is all the stuff that is actually gradually densifying and thickening, whether you want it or not. Now, those suburbs, we all moved there because it was green. But you know what? It's turning gray. And there's something to be realized here. Over the last 25 to 30 years, there's been massive deregulation in industries, in exchange, in logistics, in transportation. And as a result of that, we've seen that the rise of a series of infrastructures, big distribution centers, supply chain operations that are necessary to feed, to nourish the consumption patterns of the people that live in all that gray surface, and to actually sustain an economy there. Now, none of these supply chain elements are green and nice, but they're necessary to supply the economic system. All right, that's what this looks like, the supply chain, the architecture of the supply chain and of distribution. Nothing green here, but it's suburban altogether. So this is a tragedy. There was a foundational dream, there was a big idea that moved many of us to move to the suburbs over the last 50, 60, 70 years. That dream is idealized nature, and you know what? Through the gradual densification and the addition of supply chains and the basically denaturalization of that setting, we now have this. Some kind of a purgatory. It's no longer attractive as a natural system, but it's also not really as attractive like a city center or like a downtown. It's caught in between. Not nice nature, not nice city. Caught in between, no desire, no foundational dream, no aspiration left. Just a huge field of operations. That's the challenge, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the form of things, to figure out how shall we resupply a desire for this area, because this is where people are moving. Now, in a society where private capital plays an important role, you could argue that developments, buildings, settlements, will be trying to push the buttons of what people like. And definitely, nature is one of the things that has a lot of consensus. People like nature. So you could make a proposed development around nature, you push that button, success guaranteed. But there are other success buttons. Community. We heard it so many times throughout the day. People like to live in a community. Think about little plazas, town squares, a sense of togetherness, community. You push that button, success guaranteed. And a third button that drives most of you, I'd say here, that also operates many ways in urban design projects, is progress. If you succeed in instilling a sense of progress, technology, in your project, you push that button, people get enthusiastic. Okay, fine, so these are 3 buttons for success, but here's my question. If you add 2 of these myth ideals onto each other, you get a very powerful combination. And why am I talking about these myths or these belief systems? Because they generate a certain formal system. They generate a form of things. Nature, if that's the dream, you build curvy roads, nicely designed lawns, cottages, etc. If community is the case, you go with town squares, a different kind of order. If progress is the deal, you think about flashy transportation systems, skyscrapers, etc. All of these have their formal apparatus associated with them. So you can make combinations, and then you're guaranteed to have a successful project. But you know what? What's the killer app here? Is if you succeed in getting all these 3 buttons pushed at the same time, all of the desires of the various different constituencies addressed at the same time. Well, the only problem is that that doesn't have a form anymore. People have very different ideals about what a city or what their environment should be like. And so if you add those 3 dreams on top of each other, maybe you could argue the same would happen as what would happen to colors when they're superimposed onto each other. All the colors together equal white. Hence, the white square on white. I do think you could make the argument that, and I'll get to technology again in a second, and smart city technology specifically, but I do think that you could make the argument that the white square project, which is one where you actually, through the sheer openness of the form and the sheer lack of determinacy in the form, you actually allow people to project their own dreams, their own utopias onto that square. You've actually hit the killer app. Now, there's a serious problem here. If you think you could do this, if you think you could produce a square where you would be able to not just have all these different ideals, but also have different functions, different programs, different activities take place, well, good luck. If you look at this image, you could imagine if you want to install onto this square a series of sports fields, well, you'd have to really organize the space for that. You'd have to plant devices, put objects in there. If you want to make it a parking lot, it's a different system of things on top of that. And those actually exclude each other. If you think about a farmer's market, for instance, that would be, again, a different series of objects that need to be placed on top of that square. So it's very hard for that square to remain white. And I'll show you, for instance, if you add a few roads onto this, you get traffic signs, which you see up there. It's just getting very complicated. And this is where technological breakthroughs can help us. If you think about a situation, any kind of generic global city, I believe this must be Toronto, intersections look like this. If you're able to eliminate a series of the signs that we use to navigate space and have it resolved by objects or things talking to each other directly, you actually eliminate the need for physical installations in space. And in fact, you make that space more open to be appropriated 5 hours later by a different user group for a different purpose. So what you're doing is transforming monofunctional single-use spaces with a clear ideology into open platforms that can be used and claimed by different people all the time. It's, in a sense, more democratic, more open, but it's a very difficult formal exercise. I want to now shift for a second and talk to you about a project that we've been working on for a while now in Brussels, in the area of the abattoirs, the slaughterhouses in Rekjavik, here in Anderlecht, for a very interesting and visionary client. This is a project, this is a huge open lot where currently there's slaughterhouse activity and a lot of empty space. You'd almost think it looks like a suburban lot, except it's in the middle of the city. The proposal here is that the various activities that take place here could be reconfigured. This is currently in a district with many immigrants, and in this area we find the biggest immigrant markets in Brussels. Those of you that live here may have gone there once. It's really quite the experience. However, this market has not found its proper monumental form yet. This proposal suggests a plaza of 200 by 300 meters, truly, as far as I'm concerned, Malevic's white square. A big empty surface onto which exactly the dimensions of that market can be fit. So the big new communities that populate Brussels will ultimately add a new monument here by filling it in and taking ownership of that space. They add a monument on, fitting in the chain of 18th century and 19th century and other bourgeois monuments that are currently already existing in Brussels. But okay, so these markets take place 2 or 3 times a week. That means 4 or 5 days a week, they're still available. This space is available for other functions. If we would be able to design this space in a way that it really programmatically and functionally remains open and undetermined, then I think we can really achieve a big success and make a monument for the people. Not for one constituency or for another constituency, not for one specific function or somebody else, but in fact for all, because of the relentless elimination of obstacles and single-function objects in that space. These are a few slides of the history of this area. I will not dwell on this. The slaughterhouse activity, the neighborhood markets, well, the immigrant markets, and other markets. So, fine. If we succeed in opening up the square, eliminating the objects by having what is required for the function of these objects taken over by internet communication between them, we have made a big achievement. But there's something else. There are the buildings. As you see, this square contains 6 or 7 almost identical buildings. And here, the second part of Malevic's painting, the white around the square, comes into perspective. We propose here that these could be 6 pretty much identical buildings. Why? Because the identity and the idea of these buildings is not derived from their architectural form only. How about if we could create an openness and a platform on which you can plug almost any functionality, not just for a square, but for a building? I mean, there's actually a precedent for this. In the first industrial revolution in New England, mill buildings, the first textile mills, produced a series of very powerful 18th and early 19th century, mill buildings is what they're called, with pretty much universal platforms, open spaces into which you could place almost any program. These buildings still suffer from the limitations of steel had not been invented yet, so spans were very limited. But today, of course, we have a much better disposition of use of advanced materials. So the proposal of a universal building, an open platform building in the Brussels context, takes place with these big, basically concrete rectangles that are hollowed out and that can be combined in almost any way into a building that is open. And you can have residential, you can have parking, you even can have roadways go through it, you could have farming in it, you could have markets in it. It's truly an open building. We have to. It sounds pretentious, but there is in fact, there is no pretentiousness here as far as I'm concerned. We call this the universal building, not because we have any claims to make about it, but because, in fact, we claim to work and labor on an absence of authorship as architects. So, in fact, the role of the architect becomes really minimal and is simply a way of crafting the platform as a space for all the other people to occupy that building. This is the form of this particular exercise. We hope that there will be other buildings that may work in the same vein, but there is a way in which we now need to zoom out and pull this back to the bigger exercise. If we talked earlier about those suburbs, those densifying suburbs that are not nature, and are not city or city center or compact, historic, that basically are stuck in a place where there is no identity to be derived from nature or no happiness to be derived from it being a city, then we need to deal with that specific issue. I believe that if we work with a combination of these open squares and then the larger container buildings, let's say the urban warehouses, you could call them, and those could become a typology with which we further densify and develop our cities. So rather than having very single, monofunctional buildings sucked up between buffer spaces in an endless goo of development that is not leading anywhere in particular, but just seems to be, devoid of a kind of a cultural identity, and specifically that seems to be devoid of potential and possibility, we could actually develop in the same way, but with endless possibility. Finally, there is a durability or a sustainability argument in here, the argument being that if you put your hardware down and you have a really concrete, good working operating system, a good platform onto which all the functionalities can be plugged, that you only have to build this once, and you will be able to have all the different uses cycle through over the next 30, 40, 50, 100, maybe 200 years. So you really do create an open structure that can be owned, operated, and used by the people in a myriad of different ways that I cannot and actually do not want to begin to imagine. This could be a way in which we find and develop an identity and a democratic culture for our suburbs. I want to thank you for your kind attention.